Perhaps majority of other papers I will discuss the concept of incorruptibility. Incorruptibility and the notorious difficulties encountered by mid-18th century thinkers, biologists, philosophers, and psychologists in conceptualizing this paradoxical concept. So this is not going to be a political philosophy, but more or less 17th and 18th century metaphysics with a bit of biology. So some of the 17th century philosophers, such as Nicolas Malebranche and Leibniz, seem to have been immensely fascinated by insects and their life cycle, most notably by the metamorphosis of a chrysalis into a butterfly. For example, in Malebranche's Entretien sur la métaphysique et sur la religion, the metamorphosis of a chrysalis into a butterfly was understood as an allegory of the resurrection, while in Leibniz's Monadologie, it supports the view that the body and soul are, strictly speaking, inseparable. Hence, for Leibniz, there is no birth or death, nor generation or corruption. Birth and death are merely mistaken interpretations of transformations of one and the same eternally living body, which always preserves the same soul, and so on. Now, the 17th century metaphysics' fascination with the transformation of butterflies seemed to stem from the description of the metamorphosis of a chrysalis into a butterfly that Aristotle gives in his History of Animals. Now, in Aristotle's eyes, the chrysalis is a corpse, which is suggested by its Greek name, nekidalos, that is to say, a word that sounds similar to the word for corpse, nikos. On the other hand, the butterfly that emerges after a certain period is named psyche, the soul. Now, that's what Aristotle seems to have witnessed when observing the butterfly bursting out of the chrysalis was the soul literally leaving the dead body. As the perfect embodiment of the real distinction between mind and body, the metamorphosis of a chrysalis into a butterfly came to be understood in the late 17th century metaphysics as an argument for the Cartesian spiritualism and dualism. Now, just as the 17th century spiritualist philosophers were mesmerized by butterflies and their life cycle, so the mid-18th century materialist thinkers, for example, Lametrie and Diderot, were transfixed by another insect, namely by the freshwater polyp and its remarkable regenerative powers, which were first described by Swiss naturalist Abraham Tremblay in 1744. Now, in 17th and 18th century, the class of insects was much wider than it is today, and it included as well worms as well as polyps. Thus, for example, in Leibniz's eyes, for instance, earthworm is an insect. Now, in his Venus Metaphysique of 1745, Maupertuis, the French president of the Berlin Academy of Sciences, gives the following description of the polyp's exceptional regenerative powers. And I quote, "Now, in order to multiply the polyp," writes Maupertuis, "we only need to cut it to pieces. The head piece will regrow the tail. The tail piece will regrow the head. The pieces lacking head and tail will regrow both head and tail. This hydra certainly is more marvelous than the mythological one. We can cut it lengthwise, we can mutilate it in any way which we want. Everything is soon repaired. Each piece is a new animal." End of quote. And then in Considérations sur les corps organisés by Charles Bonnet, first published in 1762, we find the following observation. Quote, "If we cut polyp in two, lengthwise, from the head to the center of the body, we obtain a two-headed polyp. If we repeat the procedure on each of the two heads, we'll make a four-headed hydra, and by repeating it again, an eight-headed hydra. Finally, if we slaughter these heads, the hydra will grow new ones, and each slaughtered head will produce a polyp that could be turned into a new hydra." End of quote. Now, here, reality is clearly more fabulous than fiction. Now, in creating the polyp, the nature seems to have surpassed the mythology. The gelatinous creature is by far more wondrous and more fantastical than the mythological beasts. Whereas, for example, the mythic hydra of Lerna was said to have regrown its severed heads. The polyp not only regrows and replaces the lost or damaged bodily parts, but moreover, each cut off part of the animal produces a new animal. So the polyp is virtually indestructible, incorruptible. The more we dissect it, the more the living bodies multiply. Each attempt to destroy it only creates new life or new beings. Now, this fact that a polyp cut into pieces regenerates into as many new polyps as there were cut pieces gave rise to metaphysical questions that were far more complicated and far more difficult to solve than analogous questions regarding worms raised half a century before or earlier by Antoine Arnaud in his letters to Leibniz. For example, if the soul is indeed indivisible and indestructible, what can be said then, quote, about worms which have been cut in two and each part continues to move as before, end of quote. Now, since the regenerative powers of most worms are not as spectacular as those of the polyps, for example, the earthworm does not have the ability to produce two individuals when it is cut in half. In most cases, it is only the head end that survives and grows a new tail, while the tail end dies away. Leibniz, of course, had no difficulty in fielding the question. Quote, it is not necessary for the two parts of an insect cut in half to remain animated, although there may be some movement in both of them. At very least, the soul of the whole insect will remain only on one side, end of quote. Now, since, according to Leibniz, that part of the insect's body to which the soul has been united since the creation of the world, that is the part of the insect's body that is already living before birth of the insect and still alive after its death, is always, Leibniz writes, quote, as small as is necessary for it to be protected from the action of someone tearing up or destroying the body of that insect. So it is clearly impossible to divide the soul of an insect by dissecting its body. Whereas, by contrast, each incision into the polyp's body seems to split up the soul as well. Now, in an important chapter entitled Idées sur la métaphysique des insectes, Bonnet observes that the polyp, by its manner of reproduction, could be used to support the Cartesian view that animals are mere mechanical automata. Quote, at the sight of the polyp, Descartes would have triumphed, writes Bonnet. An animal that is multiplied by being cut in pieces would provide a nice argument in favor of the ingenious system of this philosopher, end of quote. Now, however, the polyp's manner of reproduction also lends itself to materialistic reading. Now, fourth, does not the fact that the polyp, cut into pieces, regenerates into as many new polyps as there were cut pieces, suggest the existence of a soul that is divisible along with its body? That is, a soul that is nothing else or nothing other than bodily organization. Bonnet, who himself was neither a Cartesian nor a materialist, offers his own peculiar answer to the above metaphysical questions. Quote, what we call production or reproduction in our species of zoophytes is nothing but the development of small organic wholes that pre-existed in the great whole whose losses they repair. There is never generation in the strict sense, but always simple evolution of that which has already been engendered. Now, end of quote. The polyp's body is composed of small organic wholes, the so-called germs, created once and for all at the creation of the world, that evolve either into new animals or new bodily parts that replace the lost ones. Thus, according to Bonnet, the power of regeneration of certain organisms is simply a result of God's providence. The maker of nature has foreseen that certain organisms would be exposed to numerous dangers, so he endowed the most fragile ones, such as polyps, worms, and so on, with the means to replace the lost or damaged body parts. And what about the souls of the newly evolved polyps? Are they produced by dividing le moi du polype, the self of the polyp, whose body has been cut in pieces? This is Bonnet's expression. Or does the maker of nature perhaps create a new soul for each newly evolved body? Asks Bonnet, and then goes on to answer the question. quote, if there is no creation of bodies, why should then we suppose a new creation of souls? If the author of nature has judged it proper to include all organized bodies into germs, isn't it likely that he has also included the souls into them that will one day become the principle of sensation and voluntary movements? Are we to imagine that at each new stroke of the scalpel, God creates a soul for the germ that is to develop? That would hardly be philosophical. End of quote. Now, if each germ contains its own dormant soul, then there are at least as many souls in each polyp as there are pieces of its body that can produce a new complete individual. Now, these souls begin to feel, argues Bonnet, only after the bodies of the newly evolved individuals reach a certain degree of complexity. Now, Bonnet then goes on to discuss various difficulties presented by Hydra, that is the multi-headed polyp produced by incision into its head. Now, some cases, such as the case of one head of the two-headed hydra literally devouring the other, which was shortly before still part of it. That is the case where it seems as if by cutting the head in two, we have split the will of the animal itself. These cases were relatively easy to solve along the lines of the preformation theory. Such hydras, as well as the two-headed worms, were called by Bonnet simply les personnes composées, that is the composite persons. But there were also cases where Bonnet seems to have found himself at a loss for words, as for example, the rare case of fusion of the brains of two polyps into a single brain. Why? He says, the insect, which is first a caterpillar, then a chrysalis, and finally a butterfly, does not take on as many different, he says, personalities as it takes on different forms, or more precisely, while there are not three selves into the caterpillar, going through different stages in its development, the caterpillar, he says, always preserves the same individuality, the same self. In the case of the fusion of the brains of two polyps into a single brain, by contrast, there are, he says, deux moi dans le même cerveau. That is, two selves in the same brain. And since it seems impossible for the two selves to have the same sensation in the same indivisible instant of time, he says, that is, since some of the affections of the body are felt by one self and some by the other self, this polyp is a perfect example of the so-called alternating or dual personality. The polyp that leads two lives alternatively with neither of the two selves having any access to the experiences of the other. So perhaps it's no small wonder that he became known later as Bonnet as the father of analytic psychology. Now the notion that in nature there are no gaps between species, but even an almost imperceptible gradation linking all three kingdoms, that is minerals, plants, and animals, into a single continuous chain, that was almost a cliché in the 18th century biology. Now to see just how strong the obsession with the idea of the so-called chain or scale of natural beings must have been in this period, it is perhaps enough to look at its perception in contemporary fiction. For example, in Louis Sébastien Mercier's novel entitled Year 2440. Now, this novel, it was first published in 1771. It was one of the, well, nowadays it's more or less forgotten. It's a wonderfully clever novel, supreme bestseller of the pre-revolutionary France. And in this novel predicts that this idea will enjoy an extremely long life. Long centuries in the future, it will be the central methodological principle of natural history. Now in the novel, just to briefly summarize, the hero falls asleep one night in year 1768, before the revolution, and wakes up in his dream in the year 2440. That is when he is exactly 700 years old. Now, while strolling around Paris, and the whole Paris is changed dramatically, It's now an enlightened utilitarian fantasy come true. For example, the Sorbonne, which was first established as a faculty of theology, and as he observes, at the Sorbonne, they no longer, he says, analyze silly sentences, but instead the whole university has been turned into an anatomy school, where the wise anatomists are dissecting the insensible corpses to the benefit of posterity, and so on and so on. And on his stroll around Paris, he enters, for example, into a temple where he sees the inscription Abrégé de l'univers above the door. Now, the temple turns out to be a panoptically arranged natural history museum in which, he says, all species of animals, plants, and minerals could be seen, he says, at a single glance. Now, immensely fascinated by the gradual order reflected in the collection and with the apparent gaps between the species that were always filled up, the hero comes to realize the truth of l'échelle des êtres, the scale of beings, the existence of which has been, as he says, in his time, that is to say in the 18th century, anticipated by some philosophers, but has been mostly disputed. Quote, one could distinctly see that species were contiguous and blending one into another. By the soft and delicate transitions from plant to animal and from animal to man, nothing was interrupted, end of quote. So in the future of Mercier's fantasy, several generations have been engaged in filling up the apparent gaps in the scale of beings, hoping that perhaps the chain of ideas will eventually coincide with the chain of beings. Now, although by the year 2440, the species have been discovered that were absolutely unknown before, and new ones created by crossbreeding, the scale is still far from perfect, and there's still a frantic search going on for the missing intermediary beings. Now, in the utilitarian society of the 25th century, there are still hermits who spent their entire lives in the woods herborizing. That's a word that comes from Rousseau, incidentally. That is collecting and studying plants, called in regularly to the temple to give the progress report on the discoveries and so on. Now, the resounding success of the so-called Trampley's polyp can perhaps best be understood against the background of this idea of this chain or scale of beings. Now, there were unmistakable gaps between minerals and plants, and between plants and animals. Now, as a perfect zoophyte, the polyp successfully bridged the second of the two gaps, that is, the gap between plants and animals. For example, capable of locomotion, the polyp was categorized as an animal, and capable of reproducing par bouture, that is, by budding, it was, however, categorized as a plant. Thus, for example, in his Éléments de physiologie, where the drawer is enumerating the examples of being that embody the passage from the vegetable to the animal kingdom, the polyps are classified as animaux plantae, that is, as animal plants. Now, the polyps' enormous success must have been significantly enhanced by the fact that Leibniz, who himself believed that, quote, in nature everything happens by degree and nothing by jumps, end of quote, had, so to say, predicted its discovery. Now, in a letter quoted, which Bonnet quotes in his Considérations sur le corps organisé, Leibniz writes, quote, men are linked with the animals, these with the plants and these with the fossils, which in turn merge with those bodies which our senses and our imagination represent to us as absolutely inanimate. And since the law of continuity requires that when the essential attributes of one being approximate those of another, all the properties of the one must likewise gradually approximate those of the others. It is necessary that all the orders of natural beings form but a single chain in which the various classes, like so many rings, are so closely linked one to another that it is impossible for the senses or imagination to determine precisely the point at which one ends and the next begins. Thus, there is nothing monstrous in the existence of zoophytes or plant animals. On the contrary, it is wholly in keeping with the order of nature that they should exist. And so great is the force of my metaphysical principle of continuity, to my thinking, that not only should I not be surprised to hear that such beings has been discovered, but in fact I am convinced that there must be such creatures, and that natural history will perhaps someday become acquainted with them, when it has farther studied that infinity of living things whose small size conceals them from ordinary observations and which are hidden in the bowels of earth, and so on and so on. Now, end of quote. Now, Leibniz's prediction, inspired by his metaphysics, came true, writes Bourdieu. In the waters, the polyp was discovered, and the two kingdoms united themselves. Now, while there was indeed an even gradation between beings in nature, and while the polyp, by its way of reproduction, embodied the passage from the vegetable to the animal kingdom, there was nevertheless still a gap remaining between minerals and plants. Quote, here nature seems to make a jump, observes Bonnet. The gradation is interrupted since the apparent organization of some minerals and crystals corresponds but very imperfectly to that of the plants. End of quote. And it is perhaps the perfect litophyte, that paradoxical being that would be a mineral and a plant at the same time, or as Diderot would say, a mineral less dead than the ours, that the hermits in Mercier's fantasy are still looking for so fervently in the 25th century. Now, for the most part, this idea of the chain or scale of natural beings was embraced by those 18th century philosophers who believed in the existence of the only one substance in the universe, for example, matter. That is the philosophers in whose eyes soul was not a substance distinct from the body, but rather an effect of the bodily structure or organization, and it therefore appeared at that end of the chain where bodies reached a certain degree of complexity. Now, before Diderot, who himself claimed that there was only one substance in the universe, and that the soul is nothing, as he says, but l'organisation et la vie, the organization and life of the body itself, such a system was developed by La Mettrie, according to whom, quote, there is in the whole universe only one diversely modified substance, and all soul's faculties depend so much on the specific organization of the brain and of the whole body that they are clearly nothing but that very organization, end of quote. Now, thus, in the article Animal of Encyclopédie, Diderot is discussing the universe as a single and unique machine in which everything is linked and in which all the beings ascend above or descend below one another by imperceptible degrees, so that there is no gap in the chain. While La Mettrie in L'Homme Plante, that is man as a plant, a short treatise, contemplates, he says, that ladder which is so imperceptibly graduated that we can see nature passing exactly through all its levels without ever missing out, so to speak, a single rank in all its different productions, end of quote. Now, admiring the uniformity of nature, in which, as he says, everything is perfectly matched and nothing out of place, and having gone to great lengths in L'Homme Plante to develop the analogy between man and plant, La Mettrie nevertheless acknowledges that the differences between man and plant are perhaps even greater than the similarities. Now, he classifies the polyps alongside those still unknown animal plants, which other families will discover in time, as he says, as intermediate or compound beings, that is, as beings which are the children of both kingdoms, vegetable and animal. Now, unlike plants, the animal plants are beings, he says, which begin to be animate. That is, their workings already manifest certain intelligence. And the animal plants have the more intelligence, the more efforts they have to make in order to find food. Now, according to the law, which states that the less an organized body has needs, the smaller is its share of intelligence, it is the absence of any efforts to find food that in La Mettrie's eyes constitutes one of the reasons against the souls of vegetables. Now, higher animals have still more mind because they have to make an effort, not only in order to find food, but also their sexual partner. Now, the absence of any effort of this sort in plants is another argument against their souls. Now, despite all the parallels La Mettrie drew between plant and man on the basis of reproduction, it remains a sad fact that, unlike humans, plants, as he says, make love without difficulty. And while reading these passages, one gets the impression that it is as if La Mettrie envied the plants their, as he puts it, twofold instrument of procreation. That is, their ability to fertilize themselves as well as their ability to copulate at a distance. Now, since the polyps do not have to make any effort to reproduce themselves, any severed part of their bodies will produce a new complete animal, they have a proportionally weak mind. Thus, in La Mettrie's eyes, the asexual reproduction and the fact that from the polyp cut into pieces there evolve as many new polyps as there were pieces are not so much an argument for what Bonnet calls the self of the polyp as they are an argument for the inferiority of its mind. Now, although man has most soul of all known beings and is accordingly placed at the top of the scale, nevertheless, in the scale of beings as depicted by La Mettrie, man cannot see himself as the epitome of creation. Now, that which the hero of Mercier's novel, Who Awoke in the Future, came to realize on the basis of the scale of beings was, for example, that, quote, nature in all her operations actively tended toward the creation of man, who consequently represents the term of its perfection, the peak of its perfection. Now, although La Mettrie's man is a perfect animal, nature certainly did not tend toward his creation. Nature must have embodied an infinite number of combinations of matter before reaching the one that could give a perfect animal, that is to say, the human being. Now, such unsuccessful combinations of matter occasionally still do occur today, as an example of a surprising mistake on the part of nature that he has seen himself, La Mettrie as a physician, as a medical doctor, cites a woman who, quote, had neither mount nor clitoris, nor nipples, nor vulva, nor labia majora, nor vagina, nor womb, and so on. She was, in short, he says, animal indéfinissable, an indefinable animal, or la femme manquée, incomplete woman. Now, that's as a random result of a series of unsuccessful combinations of matter. La Mettrie's man is nothing than, as he puts it, un beau monstre, a complete, perfect, a viable monster. Now, man may well be a perfect animal in La Mettrie's system, but his position at the top of the scale is rather precarious. He says, un rien de plus ou moins dans le cerveau, a trifle more or less in the brain, is enough for him to fall to the bottom, whereas the position of other animals on the second rank of the scale or the ladder is, as he says, more solid and stable. Now, although man has infinitely more mind than other animals, his soul is, he says, de la même pâte, of the same material, and de la même fabrique, of the same making. Now, the notorious thesis from L'Homme Machine, according to which all the soul's faculties depend so much on the specific organization of the brain of the whole body that they are clearly nothing but that very organization, is further elaborated in L'Homme Blonde as follows. Now that's a bit of a quick deduction, but anyway. Now, since he says our needs are a necessary consequence of the structure of our organs, and since our soul is determined directly by our needs, the soul clearly owes all its strength and wisdom to the number of needs. Or as stated in one of his laws in L'Homme Blonde, the more needs an organized body has, the more soul it has, or the greater its share of intelligence. That is to say, the superior quality of the human soul and its surplus de lumière, that is the excess of enlightenment, result from inadequacy or deficiency of human body. Thus, our having infiniment plus d'esprit, infinitely more spirit than other animals, simply means that we have infiniment plus de besoin, infinitely more needs. And by showing this, that si grand effet, such a great effect as the human mind, is coming from si triste cause, from such a sad cause as our bodily needs, that is by showing that our happiness and our dignity stem from such troublesome subordination to all life, to all of life's unwelcome necessities, which remind us at every instant of the misery of our origin and condition. La Mettrie has denied us our supposedly privileged place in creation and dealt a severe blow to our self-esteem. Now, this is a blow perhaps not unlike the two major ones described by Freud in his introductory lectures to psychoanalysis that in the course of centuries the naive self-love of man has had to submit to at the hands of science. Now, if between the souls of animals, animated bodies, there were no even gradations, if there were thus a gap separating man, the perfect animal, from the rest of creation, man would consider himself to be, as he says, a god on earth and would worship only himself, whereas on the basis of La Mettrie's scale of beings, he says there is no animal, however feeble and mean in appearance, the sight of which does not diminish a philosopher's self-esteem. End of quote. Now, although La Mettrie's idea that soul or mind is nothing other than, as he says, moyen, that is, means that an organized body developed in order to fulfill its own needs, in particular the need for food or and sexual reproduction, although this may all sound fanciful. Now, recent developments in evolutionary psychology do offer some support to this extravagant view. For example, in a brilliant book entitled The Mating Mind, Geoffrey Miller argues that our minds evolved not just as survival machines, but as, quote, courtship machines. That is, the most distinctive feature of human minds, creative intelligence, such as storytelling, poetry, humor, philosophical theorizing, and so on, are simply, as he says, courtship tools. So, evolved to attract, of course, sexual partners. So it was, in short, through our ancestors trying to persuade sexual partners to have sex with them that human minds have become witty, intelligent, creative, articulate, and so forth. No. So the fact that a polyp cut into pieces regenerates into as many new polyps as there were cut pieces, that is the fact that each new incision into polyp's body seems to split up its soul as well, and all the ensuing difficulties only, of course, present a problem against the background of a spiritualist and dualist ontology, while in the eyes of the materialists, however, this same fact shows that the soul is not really distinct from the body, but identical to it or its organization, and therefore, of course, material. Yeah. No, so just as the metamorphosis of a chrysalis into a butterfly, where we see with our own eyes the soul leaving the dead body, and realize that the soul is not extinguished together with the body, but is immortal, came to be understood as an argument for spiritualism and dualism, so has this tremulous polyp, with its virtually indestructible and, so to say, incorruptible, immortal body, become an argument for materialism. For example, in L'Homme Machine, La Mettrie writes, we do not know nature at all, he says, causes hidden deep within her may have produced everything. Look in your turn at Tremblay's polyp, he says, does it not contain inside it the causes of its own regeneration? Why then would it be absurd to believe that there exist physical causes by which everything was made and to which the whole chain of this vast universe is so necessarily linked and subordinated that nothing that happens could not have not happened? That it is our absolutely invincible ignorance of these causes that has made us look to a God. Thus, destroying chance does not mean proving the existence of a supreme being, for there may be something else which, he says, is neither chance nor God. I mean nature, the study of which can, as a result, only produce unbelievers, as proved by the manner of thinking of all its most successful observers. End of quote. So, if the gelatinous creature can contain the causes of its regeneration within itself, argues La Mettrie, then perhaps the matter too could contain the causes of its activity and its organization within itself, and could therefore produce the order manifest in nature by itself, that is, without God. Everything in the nature, he says, may well have been produced by the physical causes hidden in the heart of nature. So just as an intelligent being may have come from une cause aveugle, from a blind cause, so also the order discovered in nature does not necessarily presuppose une cause éclairée, an enlightened cause. Thank you.